And so you can draw this in sort of a modification of what's called an energy diagram. And effectively, what this is representing is that unless you can get these bonds to convert, unless you can add enough energy so that these bonds begin to stretch and become weak enough, and unless you can careen them into each other hard enough, they won't react. You have to get over this energy barrier. But if you reach the ignition temperature, which is sufficiently weakening the bonds and increasing the kinetic energy of the interactions, you can then cause these to form more stable bonds, and in the process, give up a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy to dissociate water into hydrogen and oxygen, and you get a lot of energy when you form the water. So it's easy to make, hard to break. Now, the heat that's given off by this process is expressed in both thermal radiation. Actually, photons are being emitted by this radiation heat. But most of it is actually retained in the water molecule as extremely vigorous vibrations of the HO bond. It's actually so hot that some of these will actually dissociate. But the point is, this is vibrating very, very vigorously. And so what happens is, if you get, say, a little lowly oxygen molecule here that's sort of meandering around and eventually gets to this point here, it can pick up some of that vibrational energy, heat the oxygen molecule, and also send it careening out at a very, very high velocity, where it may just run into another potential partner and begin this reaction all over again. This process will progress from the ignition point outward in what's called the flame front. Now, if you have a terrible mixture, say you've got tons of extra hydrogen, tons of extra oxygen, or you have a parasitic buffer gas like atmospheric nitrogen, it will interfere with this transfer of this energy that's being absorbed by the oxygen, and it will cause some of that energy to be lost to the parasitic gases, to be radiated out into the unreacted material outside of the flame zone. Now, this is hopefully what happens in your car engine, because this heat that's distributed from the reaction zone will spread out isotropically, that means evenly in all directions. And as the burn progresses, the temperature inside the volume will slowly increase. Eventually, when it's all burnt, you'll reach an equilibrium temperature, and then everything will begin to cool down. However, if you have an optimal mixture of these two components and no parasitic gases, there's nothing to interfere with this transfer of energy, this movement of the energy to new potential reaction products. And this reaction occurs, or this transfer of energy occurs supersonically. Just like light is the speed limit in space-time at which information or effect can be transmitted from one point to another. The analogy in matter is the speed of sound. It is the limit at which elastic collisions can transmit energy or an effect throughout the medium. And when the reaction is occurring at above the speed of sound, effectively all of the reaction products around the flame front, outside, not yet involved, are not affected by that process. None of the heat is distributed to it. So none of the other gases warm, the pressure doesn't go up, the volume doesn't expand, and none of the energy is being distributed to the rest of these gases. As a result, they're just sitting fat and happy, unaware of the devastation that's headed toward them. As a consequence, all of the energy is concentrated in this very thin flame front that's moving out supersonically away from the reaction zone. And when I say thin, I mean thin, like microns thick. And because that concentrated energy is in that thin sheet of expanding gases, the pressures and the temperatures are an order of magnitude, meaning a factor of 10, higher than they will eventually reach when all of this gas is burned and you reach equilibrium maximum temperature. In addition, unlike the isotropic expansion and heating in a gas volume, shock waves tend to be directional. And so they not only will move away from the initiation point in a favored direction, but they can actually reflect off of the inside of the container. They can even reflect off of pressure variations within the gas. So you not only get a concentration of the energy in time because it's so thin, but you can get a concentration in location because the shock waves focus. So you can reach orders of magnitude, hundreds of times, the peak pressure that you would equilibrium reach when the full burning occurs at the point of contact with a shock wave. And that's how it can cut through steel, and that's how it can shatter concrete. Now, if you're going to try to burn this as efficiently as possible, use up all of the potential energy, what you want is what's called a stoichiometric mix. And that's a chemistry term for sort of the perfect blend of hydrogen and oxygen. Action is complete. You've used up all the oxygen. You don't have any hydrogen left over. Everything has been consumed. And the way you determine what that golden ratio is you balance the equation. Now,